Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, as we know, the Iranians are meeting with other signatories to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, in Vienna. The Americans are also present, but the talks with the Americans and the Iranians are happening in an indirect fashion and not directly. There has been seemingly a broad roadmap which has been agreed upon for a return of the United States to the deal. Nevertheless, the Iranians insist that all sanctions must be lifted in one go for them to essentially come back into compliance as well and to stop those decisions that they have made regarding enrichment, et cetera, at the same time. How does one exactly square that circle? I mean, there is all this positive talk, and the words being used by both sides are that these talks were constructive, et cetera, but were they really that constructive? I mean, will the Americans lift all the sanctions in one go, or are the Iranians, in fact, ready to compromise on that altogether? Let's discuss that a bit further. And I'm joined by Dr. James Devine, who is an associate professor in Department of Politics and International Relations at Mount Allison University. He's joining us this morning from Sackville, New Brunswick. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Reza Khanzadeh, who's a research fellow at Sharif University think tank. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. And joining us from Arlington, Virginia is Yousof Azizi, who is a researcher of U.S. foreign policy decision-making. He's also a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech. James, Reza, and Yousof, good morning to all three of you, and thank you for your time today. James, let me start with you. As I said, a lot of positive talk, a lot of positive vibes seemingly in the air, but the insistence on all sanctions being lifted in one go seems to be remaining consistent from the Iranian side. Will the Americans play ball in that regard?
Well, I think the two working group model that we've got coming out of the meetings is probably the best we could hope for. The idea that everything is going to be done at once is probably unrealistic, but I think both sides are going to be able to work out a way, or are going to try to work out a way, where things are done simultaneously, but they are able to frame things in a way so that nobody loses face. So, for instance, Iran was saying they would not involve themselves in indirect talks with the Americans, but of course that's actually what's happened. They just called it proximity talks, or at least some of the observers have. So there are diplomatic ways, creative diplomatic ways of getting around the question of simply who goes first. It's going to be a bit of a dance that's going to have to be choreographed, but it is possible.
And Reza, there's a lot, obviously, that both sides disagree on as well. What kind of obstacles possibly do you see going forward? Or do you think that they'll be able to, as James said, diplomatically work this out such that there are possibilities to do what both of them want and domestically come out as victorious?
Yeah, it seems to me right now a very, very difficult road ahead. You look at the past almost 5 years, 4 years, primarily with Trump, obviously, with over 1,000 sanctions imposed on Iran. And when we hear what's coming out of Tehran as far as the type of sanctions they want lifted, many of those sanctions might be difficult for the U.S. to lift because of the complexity of how the Trump administration imposed those sanctions. So one example I feel might be the main example is the sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran. It has been sanctioned under two names, essentially. One is under its role as far as Iran's oil exports, but then it's also sanctioned under terrorism. Now, as far as the Biden administration being able to lift those sanctions, both of those sanctions, in order for that bank to help Iran export oil, seems difficult when it comes to the terrorism sanctions. I doubt he has the political will and the political power to do that. And I feel that's where these types of negotiations, right now in Vienna might hit a roadblock where, but then again, on the one side, you have the U.S. State Department, who was it, Ned Price, their spokesman, saying that they are willing to remove those sanctions that are inconsistent. But again, those are just talking points right now. I feel like both sides, again, have to appease to their domestic base.
Indeed.
But then also kind of give this, I guess optimistic view. But I'm pretty pessimistic right now, just to see what happens. We'll see what happens Friday. But for now, it seems very difficult.
Yousof, what are your thoughts on that? Because the one huge reality as well that many people have spoken about is the Iranian elections, right? And the need, seemingly at least, according to some experts, to support the reformist camp, as in Rouhani, going into these elections, even though, of course, he's not standing in these elections himself personally. Is that a factor, do you think? Because there's also then the other argument that, in fact, Biden's gone fairly slow in this process as well.
Yeah, I agree with you and other guests that it is not something that happened very soon between Iran and United States to come back to full compliance under the JCPOA. But on the other hand, as our U.S. and Special Envoy Robert Malley, he said that the Iran election is not a part of the factor that they put it, into the deal, into their decisions. But I don't agree. I think that one of the reasons Iran doesn't agree with the step-by-step process the United States suggested is because the United States they found the capability to affect the Iranian domestic politics. So the Iranian decision-making, Iranian political system want to dismiss that. Although the Iranian, all of them, the parliament, the executive branch, the supreme leader, all of them wants to, to reach to the position that the United States, that Iran come back to the full compliance within 2 months, within less than 2 months, as soon as possible. But on the other hand, Iranian rejected the step-by-step. One, because the United States has the hand to, to affect the Iranian domestic politics, the Iranian election, and also the United States can, ask for further negotiation for extending the nuclear talk or going for the further talk for the regional security in the future. So all of the Iranian policymakers, decision makers wanted that the sanction lifted at once because of these side effects that have for the step-by-step situation.
Yeah, and James, one of the interesting factors here, which has always been the reality, is that even under Obama, he didn't have the votes in the Senate, right, to be able to pass this through the Senate and Congress. So he passes through executive order, and that's the reality for Biden as well. I mean, if, and hypothetically speaking, if he were to be able to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal and or come to some sort of a new agreement, he doesn't have the votes either, which would support him in this regard. Because, in fact, just recently, a number of lawmakers, bipartisan group of lawmakers, said that they want the deal, in fact, to be extended to include other issues, ballistic missiles, regional activities, etc. What do you make of that?
Well, Biden would have to do it the same way Obama did, and that's, as a long-term problem, that's a serious issue for the Americans. Biden is not going to, will receive a lot of criticism for any deal that he signs. It will be impossible to satisfy the hardliners on the American side. So he's going to leave himself vulnerable over the long term to criticisms. At the same time, too, he campaigned on this issue. He has made it a part of his policy agenda. It's hard to believe that he didn't expect these sorts of impediments going forward. So I think he's going to try, and he'll probably try and do it the same way Obama did. But it's going to be a rocky road for him, certainly.
Right. So then, on the Iranian side, Reza, I wonder, this whole argument about reformist versus principlist or conservative, if we're using more mainstream terms. Is that really that different from the Iranian domestic side? Because at this point, the two sides in Iran seem like they're on the same page when it comes to what they want from the United States, right? When it comes to this deal, I mean, one side may be willing to compromise a tad bit more, but it seems like the stance has hardened a lot in Iran, right?
Yeah, it has hardened, and that is to the fault, I believe, of the Trump administration, and maybe broader, just Washington, D.C. I recall, certain quotes from Supreme Leader, Khamenei, early in 2013, 2014, where he said this would be a test for us to see if we can trust, these countries, with the United States and also the EU. He says if we can, if it does lead to positive outcomes, then we can maybe potentially look at other, issues to also, reach the, table and also to negotiate. And now that we've seen what has happened, obviously in these past 4 or 5 years, they've all toed the same line, whether you're a principlist, reformist, conservative, whatever you want to call it. And now when it comes to their elections, in Tehran coming up in June, I don't believe that is a concern, because when we look at Iran's foreign policy, it goes where Khamenei wants it to go. I think that's almost regardless to who the president is. And again, with Iran going into their, season for the elections, as far as I know right now, no one in Rouhani's administration, cabinet, what have you, has declared or shown interest that they are running, except, I believe, for his vice president. So that shows that even when you see Iran domestically in the full thick of their presidential season, Rouhani's team can still negotiate, can still come to a deal, and then whoever becomes the next president would have to follow more or less what he is being told from Khamenei's camp, with these negotiations.
So, Yousof, contextualize for us right now, what do you think the Iranians are thinking? I mean, are they desperate enough? I don't want to use that word, but that's the best word I can think of at this point in time. Desperate enough to compromise and then include other issues such as the ballistic missile program and even regional activities. I mean, is Iran under that much pressure because of the maximum pressure campaign that Donald Trump brought in?
I don't think so. As I said previously to your program, that at your program, the maximum pressure reached to its capital, to its maximum capacity. So there is no more economic pressure on Iran right now, and during these years, Iranian can resist against that. They now sell oil more than whatever they sold 1 year ago, 2 years ago. So I mean that with respect to the new deal with China and also maybe upcoming deal, strategic deal with Russia. So we can see that Iranian try to nullify, try to cancel out the what's happening through the maximum pressure. And on the other hand, Iranian has some other leverage, other tools. For example, in these advantages and improvement in their nuclear capability, in 20% enrichment, in using the advanced centrifuge, and limiting the inspection by the IAEA. So I mean, if you put all of these into one category and see the United States as either Obama administration, Trump administration, even Biden administration, they want to transfer the resources and focus from Middle East to East Asia. So the first step to handle the security in the Middle East, or even go with the further talk with Iranian over the security issues, the regional security, the first step is to handle and settle the JCPOA, the agreement, to rejoining and restoring the JCPOA. If that's happened and the trust between those countries built up, then I think that maybe in the following years, there would be a chance to talk about the regional security negotiation. But right now, I'm sure there is no one in Iran wants to go further than a nuclear talk.
James, we're quickly running out of time, so I just want to give you the final word. We have about a minute and a half left. What are the geopolitical considerations, do you think, for the Americans? Regional allies, many of them don't like the deal, never like the deal. But then at the same time, as Yousof there mentioned, the whole pivot to Asia is also a huge reality for the Americans, isn't it?
Well, as we saw yesterday with a strike against an Iranian ship in the Red Sea, the Israelis are obviously very unhappy with all of this, and they were sending a signal, both I think to the Americans and to the Iranians, that their interests and their preferences aren't going to be ignored. Whether they're going to do enough to actually destabilize or sabotage any process is a different matter. But they are sending a signal to the Americans saying, if you go down this road, you will be harming our relationship. Again, I think what it comes down to is this is not a surprise for Biden. He knew this going in. You would have to expect that he has, he's anticipated this, and he's going to be willing to pay some cost.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there at that, but we really appreciate James, Reza, and Yousof for their time this morning, speaking to us respectively. They're from Sackville, Washington, and Arlington, sharing their expertise with us about these Vienna talks that are taking place between Iran as well as other signatories to the JCPOA. The Americans at this point in time, of course, having walked away from the deal under Donald Trump, are at this point in time in indirect talks with the Iranians, i.e. not sitting around the table directly speaking to the Iranian delegation. Nevertheless, every side saying that the talks have been constructive so far. But how do you square the circle, as I said in my introduction, of the reality is the Iranians want all sanctions lifted in one go? Is it, as James said, that within diplomatic circles there will be mechanisms to be able to satisfy both sides, as well as then keep their domestic audiences happy as well, and to save face, seemingly, for both sides and their legacies and political careers? Also, that, of course, is a wait-and-see game overall. I'll be back with my next segment after this break.